Do you swear or affirm under penalty of law that the testimony you'll give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, thank you. Have a seat. Talk into the microphone.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Would you please state your name for the record and spell your last name, please?
Dr. Heather Jarrell,
And what's your current occupation?
Jarrell.
There you go.
I'm the Chief Medical Investigator at the Office of the Medical Investigator.
Great. And what are your primary responsibilities as the Chief Medical Examiner at OMI?
I oversee the operations of the OMI, including approximately 200 employees and the forensic pathologists who are there. In addition, I also perform autopsies to determine the cause and the manner of death.
Great. Can you give us a brief explanation about your educational background?
Sure. I have a bachelor's degree from Valdosta State University in Valdosta, Georgia. Then I went to medical school at Mercer University School of Medicine in Macon, Georgia, where I graduated with a medical degree. Then I completed a residency in anatomic pathology at the University of Virginia, and I'm board certified in anatomic pathology. Then I completed a fellowship, which was a 2-year fellowship in neuropathology at the same institution, and I'm board certified in neuropathology. And then lastly, I completed a forensic pathology fellowship at the Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm board certified in forensic pathology.
Can you explain to the jury what forensic pathology is?
A forensic pathologist performs autopsies to determine the cause and the manner of death.
And what about anatomical pathology?
A person who is an anatomic pathologist can perform autopsies usually in a hospital setting to determine what caused death. But they also can determine, like, for example, if you have surgery and have something removed, let's say a cancerous lesion, the pathologist is the one who determines what type of cancer it is or disease it is.
And approximately how many autopsies have you performed in your career?
I have performed and supervised over 3,500 or 3,500 examinations, plus about 500 neuropathology consultations.
And have you had any training specific to injury analysis?
Can you be more specific?
Just training in terms of determining how an injury may have affected an individual's body and how that may have contributed to the person's death?
Yes, that would be included in my forensic pathology fellowship.
Great. And have you ever testified in court as an expert witness in the fields of forensic and anatomical pathology?
Yes.
Approximately how many times?
More than 50 times.
Great. And have you rendered opinions in prior cases regarding homicides that involved guns?
Yes.
All right. And does this include testifying to the entry and exit of gunshot wounds?
Yes.
All right. Your Honor, at this time I'd move the court to recognize Dr. Jarrell as an expert witness in the fields of forensic and anatomical pathology.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Jarrell, would you explain to the jury exactly what is an autopsy?
An autopsy examination consists ultimately of 2 parts, both an external examination and an internal examination. In the external examination, we document, features of the decedent, such as hair color, eye color, weight, and stature. But we also document any injuries that we see externally. We take measurements of those injuries and we classify those injuries. The second part of the autopsy is the internal examination. I also neglected to mention that during the external examination, we collect trace evidence in suspicious cases. That might include fingernail clippings and hair samples. The internal examination consists of blood collection for toxicology when applicable, and looking at every internal organ individually to look for injury, and again classifying that type of injury, and also looking for natural disease findings. We also make microscopic slides as a result of that internal examination, which we analyze by looking through a microscope and we form a final report with the ultimate goal of determining the cause and the manner of death.
Thank you. And does every person who dies receive an autopsy?
No.
So how do you determine whether or not you're going to perform an autopsy?
An autopsy, I'll back up and explain that a little bit more. Within the state of New Mexico, the OMI is notified of all sudden and unexpected deaths. And for cases that are non-natural, there are certain circumstances where the OMI will take jurisdiction. And so in the case of deaths resulting from gunshot wounds, this is an example where the OMI, or the Office of the Medical Investigator, will take jurisdiction. And in possible homicides, the OMI will perform an autopsy.
Thank you. Can you explain to us what is the intake process when a body arrives at OMI? What is that intake process like?
When a body arrives at the OMI, the body is received in a sealed body bag, so that chain of custody is maintained from the scene to the OMI to ensure that no one's tampered with anything inside the body bag. We break the seal, and we have a machine at the OMI called a CT scanner, just like in a hospital if you have to get a CAT scan. And the body at the OMI receives a full body CT scan. This allows us to have a look inside the body before we actually open the body. For gunshot wound cases, it lets us know if there's a gunshot wound track and if there is a retained projectile. And so that is the beginning of the intake process.
Thanks. And I'm going to get into some greater detail about the CT scan in this case and further questions. But right now, describe to us, as part of the intake process, is it typical for sometimes for items to arrive along with the decedent's body?
Yes.
So what might arrive?
Per our state statute, anything present on the body should come with the body. In this case, there were personal belongings that included clothing that came present with Ms. Hutchins' body.
Great. Do you gather any statements prior to conducting an autopsy?
If law enforcement is present to view an autopsy, which is not uncommon, I will usually ask if they have any questions before I start, and I will communicate autopsy findings to anyone who is there to view autopsy. We also, before I issue cause and manner of death, when relevant, will review law enforcement reports.
So you mentioned kind of the external examination. Is there another step to the autopsy process?
There is the internal examination.
Right. And can you explain what that is briefly?
During the internal examination, we make an incision on the chest and the abdomen to look at the internal organs. We also make an incision on the head and remove part of the skull to look at the brain.
As part of the external examination, what sort of things are you looking for on the outside of the decedent's body?
On the external examination, again, we're looking at certain physiological characteristics or physical characteristics of the decedent, but we're also looking for any injuries that might be present, and again, we take measurements of those and we classify what type of injury they are.
And how do you document the external examination?
The external examination is documented. I typically use a body diagram and I make notes. If there's any tattoos, I'll document where those are. And then if there's any injuries, I'll document on a body diagram what type of injuries they are.
And do you take photographs as part of this?
Yes.
Thank you. And let's talk now in a little bit more detail about the internal examination. How do you proceed about conducting an internal examination?
How much detail do you want?
Just give me an idea in terms of, are you looking for whether the death was caused by an injury versus a natural disease? just kind of a high-level description of what you're looking for.
Yes, the combination of the external examination and the internal examination are looking at any documented natural disease or injuries. If there are injuries, do they account for death? Is there any natural disease that accounts for death? And again, when we perform toxicology, is there any toxicological cause of death or contributory factors to death?
And as part of that, do you ever collect samples of tissue or fluids?
Yes.
And can you explain that process?
Yes, we typically will collect blood to perform toxicology in certain cases to determine if that caused death or contributed to death. As I mentioned before, we also collect hair samples, other blood samples that could be used for DNA testing if needed later, and we collect fingernails, clippings for what we call a so-called homicide workup.
Perfect. And was an autopsy performed on Halyna Hutchins in this case?
Yes.
And who conducted that autopsy?
I did.
Great. What was the date of that autopsy?
The autopsy was performed on October 22nd, 2021.
Great. And how did you identify the decedent as Halyna Hutchins?
I believe she was identified by a visual identification. We can also do comparison to identification like a driver's license.
Great. And what was your role in this particular autopsy?
I was the person who conducted the full autopsy.
Great.
So I'm the person who did the external examination and the internal examination, wrote the report, and certified cause and manner of death.
Great. So it was you who was ultimately responsible for issuing the findings?
Yes.
Great. Did you review all of the photographs related to the autopsy to form your opinion?
Yes.
Thank you. Were you able to render an opinion regarding the cause and manner of death for Mrs. Hutchins?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion for cause of death?
Death was caused by a gunshot wound to the chest.
And what was the manner of death?
I certified the manner of death as accident.
And can you explain why you classified it as an accident?
Yes. I classified the manner of death as accident. Well, let me back up to go to a homicide is classified as a volitional act caused by another to cause fear, harm, or death. Intent is not always needed. It is a common element, but it is not always needed. Conversely, for an accident to be applicable, what must not be present is an intent to cause fear, harm, or death. Looking at the material that was available to me through law enforcement reports, it was apparent to me there was no obvious intent to cause death. It doesn't mean there's no negligence or so on, but it means there was no intent to cause death. Additionally, there are medical examiners across this country that would have certified the manner of death in this case as homicide. However, reviewing the material that was applicable to me, it is clear that there was a belief on the set that the firearm was not loaded with live ammunition. And based on that belief, and this scenario being much different than what we see in other medical examiner cases for firearm-related deaths, I felt that the manner of death was best classified as accident. And thirdly, there has been somewhat of a precedent set in a previous movie set shooting death where the manner of death was classified as accident.
Great. Thank you so much. You mentioned earlier when you first started your testimony that you sometimes perform a CT scan on the decedent's body. Did you perform one in this case?
Yes.
And what did that scan reveal?
The scan revealed that there was no significant natural disease for Ms. Hutchins. It also demonstrated a gunshot wound track. It demonstrated that there was medical intervention prior to her death in the form of surgical intervention that was conducted at UNMH or the University of New Mexico Hospital. And it also demonstrated that there was no retained projectile within Ms. Hutchins' body.
Thank you. When Ms. Hutchins first arrived at OMI, do you recall what she was wearing?
She was wearing undergarments, and she was wrapped in a hospital blanket.
Okay. Did any clothing arrive with her?
Yes.
And do you recall what that was?
Yes, there was a jacket, or I classified it as being a jacket. And there was also a pair of tights and a pair of pants.
Great. At this time, Your Honor, I'd like to move for admission of States Exhibits 113 and 114, their photographs, and they've been stipulated to by defense counsel.
All right, admitted.
May I publish them?
Yes.
All right. Is there an image on your screen?
Yes.
Okay. Does that appear to be the jacket that arrived with Miss Hutchins?
Yes.
Did you do any examination of this jacket?
I did a visual inspection.
And why did you do that?
For firearm-related fatalities, we look for defects of the clothing that correspond to any gunshot wounds on the body. In particular, we will look at the defect that corresponds to the gunshot entrance wound, and we look for visible soot or dark particulate material that would help us indicate a range of fire.
And did you find any of that on this jacket?
No.
Okay. And so what kind of conclusion can you draw from the absence of gunpowder or that kind of thing?
The absence of soot, unburned gunpowder particles, and gunpowder stippling on the clothing and or body would indicate a distant or an indeterminate range of fire. Indeterminate range of fire would be applicable if there is an intermediate target, meaning that the projectile went through something else before it struck Ms. Hutchins. There was no indication that the projectile went through anything before it struck Ms. Hutchins, and therefore the range of fire is best classified as distant.
Great. And just to be clear, when you say distant, can you put some actual measurements to that, perhaps in feet?
It's difficult to say, but what we generally say very conservatively is that to get the best idea of the actual distance of the firearm to Ms. Hutchins' body would be to do a examination or sorry, the word has left me. A firearm test where you test the actual firearm with the actual ammunition to try to get the range of fire. However, generally speaking, in forensic pathology, we can estimate that distance roughly to be about 2 feet or greater.
2 feet or greater. Great.
Yes.
Thank you. If you look at your monitor, I put up States Exhibit 114. Do you recognize these?
Yes.
And what are they?
These are the pants that were received along with Ms. Hutchins' body.
And were you able to make any findings or determinations on the basis of these pants?
There were no defects that were significant. The clothing had been partially cut or cut due to resuscitative efforts, but there's nothing significant from my point of view with regard to the gunshot wound.
Great, thank you. And you've mentioned the gunshot wound, so let's talk about that. How many gunshot wounds were there?
There were 2.
What injuries were you able to observe externally?
There was a gunshot entrance wound in the right armpit region, and there was a gunshot exit wound on Ms. Hutchins' back just below the left scapula or the left shoulder blade area.
Thank you. Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to move for admission of States Exhibits 115, 116, and 117. These have also been stipulated to by defense counsel.
All right, admitted.
And may I publish those?
Yes.
Dr. Jarrell, what are we looking at here?
This is a photograph before Miss Hutchins' body was cleaned, which I typically do with regard to gunshot wounds. The reason why I do this is because things like soot can wipe off. And so I like to take photographs before the wound is clean that demonstrates that there is no soot surrounding the entrance wound. But what is depicted in this photograph is a gunshot entrance wound in the right armpit region. Surrounding the entrance wound is an abrasion or a scratch that is likely due to the positioning of Ms. Hutchins' arm when she was shot. And so that's just an abrasion that was caused by the projectile as it entered the armpit area.
Thank you. And you also mentioned an exit wound. Can you explain what this photograph is?
Yes, this is the gunshot exit wound, which was left of the midline, left of Ms. Hutchins' midline on her back, below the left shoulder blade. It does show, and this is again before it has been cleaned, which again is a standard practice. But this is the exit wound. It has some bruising around the exit wound that was probably caused by medical intervention and placement of a plastic device to help render medical aid.
Thank you. I'm going to pull up State's Exhibit 117, and this may help you explain. I know you tried to explain where the exit wound was in terms of her back, so this may give the jury a little bit better idea of where that was. But just to be clear, this is the same exit wound as from the previous picture, correct?
Yes.
And do you notice anything different or remarkable in this picture that you didn't already discuss in the previous one?
No, it just gives a better orientation.
Great, thank you.
Your Honor, can you approach just a moment?
All right. Dr. Jarrell, based on the examination and your review of the photographs, were you able to track the path of the projectile from where it entered Ms. Hutchins' chest and where it exited?
Yes.
And can you explain that path?
Yes, the projectile entered through the right armpit area. It missed the major blood vessels in the shoulder area and in the arm. It entered the right aspect of the chest into the right chest cavity. It injured some of the blood vessels that travel along the ribs, broke some ribs, or broke one rib, went into the right lung, and exited the right chest cavity just adjacent to the vertebral column. It went through the spinal cord and traveled through the soft tissue of the back before exiting.
And as part of that examination, did you use what's called a trajectory rod?
Yes.
And what does that help you do?
The trajectory rod just simply shows the pathway, the general pathway that the projectile took through the body from the point of entrance to the point of exit. And that trajectory with respect to Ms. Hutchins' body is front to back, right to left, and downward.
And were the injuries that Ms. Hutchins suffered to her internal organs consistent with being shot?
Yes.
And of the injuries that you described, which of those can be lethal?
There was documented in medical record there was over 1 liter of blood present in the right chest cavity when Ms. Hutchins arrived to UNMH, or the University of New Mexico Hospital. And so that indicates significant blood loss within the chest cavity, and the injury to the right lung was also lethal.
Thank you. And I know you mentioned earlier that you took tissue samples for toxicology testing. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what were the results of those toxicology tests?
The toxicology was negative for alcohol and common drugs of abuse.
Okay. Nothing further?
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Doctor, I first want to ask you about your classification. Now, you've been doing autopsies, you said, I think, 33,000 or 3,500?
Yes, 3,500.
3,500. How long, how many years have you done autopsies?
I came to the OMI straight out of fellowship in August of 2014.
Okay, so 10 years.
Yes.
And you are very familiar with the classification system, whether it be a homicide or accident, correct?
Yes.
And in this case, you ruled the cause and manner of death to be accident.
Yes.
And in a homicide, your definition you gave was to rule it a homicide, it has to be a volitional act caused by another to cause death, correct?
Yes.
And volitional means purposeful?
No.
What does volitional mean?
Volitional volitional means a voluntary act. It doesn't mean that there is it doesn't always mean there is intent. You don't need intent. So something as simple as pulling a trigger could be the volitional act.
Okay, but in this case, you reviewed reports and you got information, and based on that, your determination was that this was an accident.
Yes.
And when you said accident, I think you described that as what must not be present is intent to cause death.
There should not be intent to cause fear, harm, or death.
Okay.
That's correct.
So in the materials you read and the information you reviewed, you did not find an intent to cause death by anybody.
That's correct.
Okay. And with regard to that classification, that is an official state of New Mexico ruling, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that is an accident.
Yes.
Okay. I know in your notes that you documented the approximate time of the incident was about 13:48. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that is 1:48?
Yes.
Okay. And then you documented that Ms. Hutchins arrived at the hospital approximately 15:20. Is that right?
Yes.
And that is 3:20.
Yes.
Now, that is approximately an hour and a half delay. Is that right?
Yes.
And you knew that she was being attended to by EMT personnel and there was a helicopter waiting to take her to the hospital. Is that right?
Yes.
And do you have any idea why there was a delay in the hospital taking her?
No.
Okay. Now, during your findings, you did a CT scan before your external examination, correct?
Yes.
Did you find evidence of prior medical intervention from Ms. Hutchins?
Yes.
And what was that evidence of medical intervention?
She had been intubated. The intubation was actually in the wrong place. It was in the esophagus. It was removed when she arrived at the hospital, but she was also re-intubated into her esophagus and not into the airway. She had also had surgical intervention. So they had opened up the chest cavities on both sides due to the presence of a gunshot wound. They had also opened up the protective covering surrounding the heart to try to do what they call manual cardiac massage to restart the heart. It's my understanding that she was pulseless upon arrival and non-responsive and not breathing.
You said that she had an intubation and another intubation. Is that right?
Yes.
And they were both in the esophagus.
Yes.
Now, an esophageal intubation can be a dangerous situation, correct?
It's an ineffective way to respirate someone or to establish air.
And in fact, can that potentially cause an anoxic situation, lack of oxygen to the brain?
Well, the injury itself is what causes the anoxic situation, but the intubation into the esophagus isn't giving adequate airway establishment.
Because, doctor, when you do the intubation, you're trying to get it into the bronchus, correct?
Yes.
And the bronchus, can you tell the jury what the bronchus is?
The bronchus, the main stem bronchus, is the main airway that goes to both lungs. It eventually divides into a left and right bronchus. It goes to each lung.
And so by putting it in the esophagus, that is basically sending oxygen into the stomach.
Yes.
And part of your notes, I know you indicated that Ms. Hutchins was complaining of shortness of breath.
Yes.
And so an intubation into her esophagus would not have assisted with that, with helping her to get that oxygen.
That's correct.
Did you also find on your CT examination that there was a chest needle that was tried to put in?
They attempted to put in a central line, which means you're trying to get fluid to in the most effective way possible. Because of her situation, they had to put blood products directly into her heart.
And did that, based on your review of that CT exam, it looked like it did not go in properly?
No, it was in the heart.
Oh, it was.
I believe it was.
Okay. So that wasn't a shallow insertion?
I couldn't tell that based on the autopsy or the CT.
Okay. So the esophageal intubation, do you know who performed that? Do you know who did that?
I do not.
The CPR efforts you observed, do you know who performed those?
Not off the top of my head, no. I would have to review the medical records.
Based on everything that you saw as a medical doctor, had this not taken an hour and a half, had Ms. Hutchins received more timely medical intervention, could she have possibly survived these wounds?
That's difficult for me to answer that question because I'm not a doctor who treats gunshot wounds in the chest, and I have a very skewed view regarding the lethality of gunshot wounds. So that's outside my purview.
When you were interviewed, didn't you say she possibly could have survived?
Potentially, but I'm not the best person to ask for that question because I don't treat patients.
Okay, but you previously had said that. You
Yes.
acknowledge that. Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. I have nothing further.
Counsel